So I just want to say today something about how the spiritual life is incomplete if we're not with a missionary heart. The spiritual life is not about focusing on yourself. In fact, your whole life's not about you, let's face it. We're called to serve. The apostles were one time sort of disputing amongst one another, who's the greatest? And Jesus was walking ahead. They didn't know he understood what they were saying. And so when they got to the house where they were going to, Jesus said, "What were you talking about?" They said, "Oh, nothing." And he said, "I know what you're talking about." And then he began to say to them, "Look, whoever wants to be great among you must be least of all and servant of all." That's the greatness, isn't it? To be other-centered. And so there's two ways this happens, of course. Through sharing the good news of Jesus with others, what we might call evangelization, and then secondly, having compassion for the poor in service. So we've found such a great treasure. His name is Jesus. And we need the joy of our heart to share this joy with others. We've fallen in love with the Lord, so we shouldn't keep it to ourselves, but we need to let others know about him. So it's not a matter of strategies, but just being who we are, sharing the gift that we've received. It's not an arrogant thing. It's not condescending. It's just one beggar sharing with another beggar where the bread is, We're convinced that the answer to the deepest questions of the human heart are Jesus. The question in the heart, who am I? Do I have worth? Where's my security? Am I significant? All these questions find their ultimate answer in Jesus, who brings meaning and purpose to our lives. So it's important then we have a heart to share the good news of God's love with others, a heart to share who Jesus is, because we know that the deepest longing in the heart of every person is for Christ, even though they don't know it. They're looking for joy and peace in their lives that will only come from Christ himself, the fullness of life Jesus promised. Secondly, I think it's important that we have compassion growing in our hearts for the poor, and that we actually throw ourselves into action in this regard. So, as it were, Pope Francis talks about touching the suffering flesh of Christ in those who are in some ways marginalized, or those who are sort of in some way needy, finding him in the distressing disguise of the poor, as Mother Teresa used to say. There is a tendency for us to be indifferent, like the priest and the Levi in Jesus' story. They walked past the man who was suffering on the side of the road and been beaten up by robbers. And then the Samaritan man came along, the least expected one, stopped and looked after him. Are we people who will pass by on the other side? Or will we stop and listen to the cry of the poor and attend to those who are most in need? Our spiritual life just can't be self-enclosed. Our spiritual life, that must overflow into action. Our faith has to have action, otherwise it's not really genuine faith. Look at the other parable that Jesus told of the rich man feasting sumptuously and with purple clothes and everything, which shows he was a very rich man. And Lazarus is at his gate, covered with sores and poor and begging. And the rich man would walk past him every day without even noticing him. You see, it's a heart that's closed to the cry of the poor, insulated from those that are most in need. So if we're going to be genuinely moving in a spiritual life, it's important for us to be practically active in care for those who most need that care. Now, Jesus at the Last Supper said, "This is my body, which will be given for you." But then he also said, "As often as you do it to the least of my brethren, you do it to me." Where is the body of Christ? We partake of the body of Christ in the Eucharist, but we also discover Christ's body in the poorest of the poor. That's a mystery, isn't it? Mother Teresa tells a story about one of her sisters who was having trouble finding Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor. And so Mother said to her, "Well, look, when you see the priest handling the body of Christ at the Mass tomorrow morning, just think of of what he's doing, and see how gently he holds the body of Christ. And then she said, when you go out and you're with the man on the street who's suffering, just remember you're holding the body of Christ. And she did that, and she came back that night really excited. She said, yes, I was actually dressing this man and helping his wounds and everything in the house for the dying. And I knew that I was touching into the body of Christ himself. And so she had that revelation of the connection between the Eucharist and our work with the poor. So the poor are our people. Pope Francis encouraged us to have a loving attentiveness to make friends with the poor and to be there with them and opening our heart to them and discovering something about ourselves that we didn't know through acting and loving with the poor. So the point here is just very simply, is in a spiritual life, not to be focused on yourself. You know, the spiritual life is to lose yourself for the sake of others. And this is an important dynamic that we can become really spiritual, as it were, and really devotional with all our different devotions and rosaries and all that sort of thing, which is very good. But we can lose our heart that goes beyond that, because we become sort of self-congratulatory about our own spiritual development and forget to serve the Lord in the poor and forget to actually share the love of Jesus that we know in our own hearts with others who don't yet know the love of God. And bless his name.